Next case, again, is really a little bit different from maybe anything you've had to do before, but it's definitely not hard. If you're adding a negative number to a negative number, this is the next easiest case. In other words, a negative to a negative number, then the result is always negative. Negative, right? So it's always going to be negative. So negative plus negative is always going to give you a negative. Now, before we do any problems or examples or anything, I want you to think about what this means, right? I told you a negative number in the previous sections. A negative number is nothing more than basically explaining when you don't have something, but in fact you owe something to somebody else. So if I have negative 5 apples, then I don't actually have any apples at all. I actually owe somebody else. I've borrowed 5 apples. So I didn't have anything to begin with, but somehow I owe somebody else 5 apples, so the way I represent that is negative 5 apples, or negative 5. Now let me ask you, if I already owe somebody 5 apples, so I have negative 5 apples, but then I go down the street and I borrow 5 more apples from somebody else, so I actually owe somebody else 5 more apples, so that's another negative 5 apples. Then I have the negative 5 apples that I had to begin with because I owed somebody else 5 apples. And then I owe a different person 5 more apples because I borrowed some more. Then how many do I owe altogether? How many do I owe altogether? I owe 5 apples to this guy and I owe 5 apples to this guy. So altogether I actually owe 10 apples. So that's negative 10 because in our whole algebra world, negative means a deficit, something that you owe somebody else. It's on the other side of the number line, on the other side of 0. So if I owe 3 Band-Aids to somebody and then I go borrow 5 more, then the negative 3 plus the negative 5, I'm going to owe 8 Band-Aids altogether, so that's a negative 8. So that's what I'm saying. When you add a negative number to a negative number, the answer is always negative, because if you start out owing somebody something and then you borrow more stuff, you're always going to owe something in the end, and you're going to owe the addition of those two things because you borrowed more stuff, right? So let's do some quick examples to show how this might work. So if you had negative 3 plus negative 3, that would be negative 6. So if I borrowed 3 Band-Aids and I borrowed 3 additional Band-Aids, then in the end of the day I'm going to owe all these people 6 Band-Aids total. So you see what you're doing here is when you're adding negative numbers together, you end up adding the absolute values together. 3 plus 3, that's why we had to learn absolute value. You add the 3 plus 3 to get 6, but the sign that you put out front is going to always be negative in this case because negative plus negative is negative. That's what I'm trying to teach you by patterns here. So another example, if I had negative 2 plus negative 3, I'm going to add the absolute values together, so I'm going to have 5, but it's negative plus negative, so I'm going to actually put a negative 5 there. So if I already owed somebody 2 cotton balls, and I borrowed 3 more cotton balls, then at the end of the day, I owe all these people 5 cotton balls altogether. So negative 4 plus negative 5 is equal to adding the absolute values together. 4 plus 5 gives me 9, but I can't put positive 9. It's got to be negative 9 because I already owed somebody 4 tires, and then I borrowed 5 more tires, so I owe 9 tires altogether. That's what the negative sign means. And so one more, negative 2 plus negative 11. If I want to add them, I'm going to add the absolute values. 2 plus 11 is 13. But the answer is not positive 13. That wouldn't even make any sense. If I owe somebody something and then I borrow more stuff, I'm not going to have positive. I'm going to have a negative number because I'm going to owe 13 units of whatever, 13 candy bars. If I borrowed 2 to begin with and then I borrow 11 more later in the day, I'm going to owe 13 candy bars altogether. So you see, you've already learned something that a lot of people struggle with for a long time in pre-algebra. Adding these negative numbers together. But if you know what it means, it is definitely not hard. Now, you definitely need to remember this. Negative plus negative is negative. But hopefully with a few of these examples, I've solidified it a little bit more for you. Now, I want to show you one more thing with the number line. Definitely do it exactly the way in which I showed you. But let's take this one right here, for instance. Let's draw a little segment of a number line here. Let's say this is 0. The number line goes off that way too, but let's say it's 0. And then I have negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5. Negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, negative 1. Now we start out at negative 2, so we put our little initial dot sort of right here. So we're going to start here. Right? We start out here, and we're going to add to it negative 3. Right? Now, in the number line problems we did before, usually when you add numbers together, you go this way on the number line because you're adding and you're getting bigger. However, you're not adding a positive number here. You're actually adding a negative number, which is adding a deficit or adding, basically you're borrowing more stuff. So anytime you add a negative number, you're going to be going this direction. It just makes sense. You need to think about what you're doing. So you're going to add 3 more. 1, 2, 3. And that's why you end up at 5, negative 5, and that's why the answer is negative 5. I'm just trying to give you a little graphical help on why this might be the case. So the next one, 0, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So negative 4 is negative 1, 2, 3, 4. And negative 9 is here. So then if you're going to represent this addition right here graphically, you're going to start at negative 4. This is your start point. That's why I put start. And you're going to add negative 5 more, but you're not adding a positive number, you're adding more borrowing. So in fact, you're going to go this direction. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You added negative 5 more, and that gets you at a grand total of negative 9. So all of the number line stuff that we did is super important because it kind of explains to you graphically what you're doing with this addition and subtraction. And you could whip out a number line for every time you wanted to add numbers together. You could totally do that. However, as you can see, it would get very cumbersome to just write number lines all the time. So don't do that. I'm just trying to give you kind of a foundation of what we're doing here. Don't draw a number line every time. Just think about the rules I'm telling you. Positive plus positive always gives you positive. This is what you learned in first grade. Negative plus negative is always going to give you negative, and to find the number, you just simply add the absolute values together of the numbers. In other words, you add the numbers themselves together, and you slap a negative on front. So we've covered positive plus positive. We've covered negative plus negative. The only other combination is if you have a positive plus a negative, or a negative plus positive. And that's actually going to be the same bucket.